Comics.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
We like
Comics.
because they have no bones.
I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White.
And
this is We Like
is.
Comics, because you're supposed to say that and not me.
either or. But this is We Like Comics because they have no bones. That is right. I agree with you.
All right. And you can check us out on social media at Boneless Comics Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok now. And at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter.
And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for videos, after shows, bonus content, and more at tinyurl.com/boneless comics podcast. And just a quick shout out for our listeners around the world in Argentina, Germany, Canada, and there's a lot more. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks everybody for listening. And I think today we've got a pretty dense story to get into, so we'll just get right into it. We're going to be covering the Umbrella Academy Apocalypse Suite, which is volume 1 of the Umbrella Academy from 2008 by Gerard and Gabriel Bodin. And I am pretty sure that I'm not pronouncing that right because there's an accent mark over the A, but I also have no idea how I'm supposed to pronounce it. So we're just going to go with Ba for now.
By the way, that sounds good to me.
Okay, well.
So I did actually look that up. I think that is correct because you could say it like BA or some, other vowels in there, but I think in Portuguese it'd actually be Ba.
Oh, okay. Well, perfect.
So there we go. So Gerard Way, which, when I said Ba the way, that was the joke there. But anyway, segue. We have talked about Gerard Way a little bit on this podcast before. So check out season 1, episode 11 for Edge of Spider-Verse, where we do give a brief synopsis of several writers, including one Gerard Way, who wrote the issue introducing us to Penny Parker and Spider, or SPDR, from 2014. So we've encountered him before. He's written a lot of stuff. He's a pretty cool guy. At least he seems that way from, what we've read online and the stuff that we've read of him. So go check out that episode for more.
Yeah. And so Gabriel Bodin, the penciler, is a Brazilian-born comic book artist. And his twin brother, Fabio Moon, is also a comic book penciler in the field. So it looks like that's kind of a family business. His works have been published in multiple countries, most notably France, Italy, Spain, Brazil, and the United States. And his first work was self-published all the way back in 93 with the assistance of his brother, which may explain the title Sunflower and the Moon, Fabio Moon. I don't know. He's done a pretty sizable amount of work for Dark Horse Comics since publishing that. And he was even nominated for an Eisner Award for his D.E. Tales book, which was considered one of Booklist's 10 best graphic novels of the year. His nomination was in the category of Best U.S. Edition of International Material, which I didn't even know was a category. So that's cool, though. Sounds like Dark Horse was in the process of kind of bringing some international stuff over, so that's kind of neat.
Mm-hmm.
Through Ba's career, it's shorter than a lot of other people that we've covered because he hasn't done any work for the big two, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. But he has still worked with some industry legends like Matt Fraction, who, again, I think he wrote that X-Force run that we really liked. And I've also got some Captain America stuff by Fraction that was really good. And he's also worked with Mike Mignola on BPRD 1947. And he's been published in anthology books alongside the works of Frank Miller and Will Eisner, who's the person that the Eisner Awards are named after. So nearly all of his Western publication history, though, is through Dark Horse or Image Comics. And he has many self-published projects throughout as well. So it seems like he's one of those guys that if he has a creative idea and he wants to get it out there, it's not going to stop him that some publisher isn't picking him up. He's going to go ahead and just produce it and put it out there anyway. So his most well-known works are The Umbrella Academy, which of course we're, reviewing today with Gerard Way, and Casanova with Matt Fraction. So before we get too deep into the story, what did you think of the art in this one?
You mentioned BPRD, or Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, which, no such place exists, of course.
There is no such thing.
But that's from Hellboy. It seems like that would be a really good fit for his art style. I want to say, I swear in my mind, there's been some kind of animated either Hellboy movie or something else that looked very similar in style to
Mhm.
his art style. I don't know if it was, influenced by him or if he had any part of it, or if it's just, the way I see it in my head. But basically, like, it's not like that loose cartoony flavor where everything's just kind of
Mhm.
all over the place and everything blends in. There's a lot of straight lines, sharp edges, wacky expressions. So like you see a talking animal or a giant octopus, it doesn't look as much realistic as it does stylized. And I
Yeah.
think that really fits the tone of the story, and it definitely gives you that, like, okay, we are watching something very different than what we're used to, because it's not that like either hyper realism or hyper cartoonism. It's sort of like its own, like if cartoons were real, this would be this is real for that. I don't know. It's hard to explain.
Yeah, it's very, very stylized. And really, if I only have one criticism of it, I think it's a little too close to Mike Mignola's style from Hellboy to have enough of its own character. I think it's very clear, especially with him starting his career in 93. That's about when Hellboy first came on the scene. I think Gabriel Bott is very influenced by Mignola's work.
Okay.
It does have a very similar look to it. So saying that one of the Hellboy movies, those probably took Mignola's style and then tried to push it a little more cartoony. That's kind of how I feel about what Gabriel Bott is doing. He's got a lot of the heavy shadows, the sort of like really simplified and pared down character designs, and kind of like a less is more approach to art where they show more stuff with shadow and color than they do with like line necessarily. I think it is a little bit more cartoony and maybe a little more almost like humorous than the Hellboy art, because Hellboy tends to play up like the horror or like the scariness of something, even though it does have some kind of like comic sensibility. I mean, comic in the sense of like comedic sensibility to it. But this definitely has even more of like a comical look to the art. Like the character designs are pretty like outlandish. I mean, we've got a character who's like a head on the body of a gorilla wearing a spacesuit, basically. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. And they kind of toned a lot of that stuff down for the Netflix show, which maybe we can talk about more in the after show. But it's kind of disappointing because the like crazy outlandish look of everything is really a character in the comic book.
Yeah, it's kind of like the lens that we're seeing this world through.
Right.
But it's not like, I wouldn't say the color palette is like a Hellboy where it's horror, kind of like you said, that more kind of comedic tone and just outlandish, like, hey, there's an octopus and its tentacles are everywhere and it's just normal, like nobody's batting an eye at like, oh, that's weird, like in Doctor Strange or anything like that. It's very like it's just normal. Yeah, this is what we do every day.
And it's interesting about the colors too, because he does use the same colorist as Mike Mignola, but it's a lot more varied palette than what you would see in Mignola's stuff, because his is basically like, in this issue, we're going to use only tones of one color, that kind of thing. And this was a lot more varied. So again, it's not in a horror genre, even though there are horrific things that happen in it. It's definitely more of a hard sci-fi look.
Yeah. So. And it's definitely weird.
Yes, it is.
The story starts off with a big pink alien dude wrestling an alien squid thing. And that's where I was getting all the tentacles everywhere. And so basically this big pink alien dude uses an atomic flying elbow to win the match. And an occurrence of complete coincidence, 43 children are born around the world to women who weren't even pregnant. So right off the bat, it sounds very strange. And so if you can imagine this sort of like cartoonish but brightly colored sort of comedic style with this big pink alien dude and an octopus, that's pretty well I think a good representation of this story and sort of what it's about. And then obviously the children are what feed into that, since this is an academy, which
this is a good setup for the tone that you're going to see pretty much throughout this story.
Yeah, so we have 43 children around the world. And so we have this world-renowned scientist and wealthy entrepreneur by the name of Sir Reginald Hargreaves, aka the Monocle, because he wears a monocle. So of course that's a nickname. a moniker, if you will, a monocle moniker, who himself also is a space alien. And he scours the world and he finds 7 of these 43 children. And then he disappears from the public spotlight. He's basically saving them for something that's going to happen later in the future. And there's a big headline that says, "From what?" And then we don't hear from him for 10 years until the children resurface.
Yeah. What we're to understand is that he's basically taking these children to prevent the end of the world. And so there's some growing threat that's coming that, is kind of undefined, and that's why he's taken these children to save the world. But then what is it? The people are like, to save us from what?
Yeah.
So, and that's the answer that we don't really know heading into this. But did you care for the tone of this overall? I mean, I know that it's really out there, but I also think, at least for my own opinion on it, this is a story that is best told in comic books. It really fits the medium well because it is so over the top. And in a lot of ways, I think that made this really hard for them to adapt for TV as well.
Yeah, I could see it being hard to adapt for live action. That's, for certainly sure. But without giving too much of my review away, I will say that, this in comic form, especially as we get into the story, there's certain things that they sort of tell you and they give you and you're just sort of supposed to accept, and then they move on. And so you're left with like, okay, there were 43 children, for example, and this guy found 7, but where did the rest of them go? Do we ever see them again? What happened to them? What caused them? How does some atomic flying elbow cause women who have never been pregnant before to give birth to children? Like, there's no logical science to it. It's just, hey, things happen, and it's kind of chaos. And it's just like, well, anything can happen. And so it sort of removes that plot device of, now it's not just, well, it's clearly this is a plot device to move the story. It's like, well, everything's a plot device because it's all just whatever you want it to be. If you think of a banana with rainbow sprinkles and ice cream and it's walking down the street, I mean, that could be something just legitimately that you would see in a story like this. So for me to abandon that sort of like logical structure is kind of difficult to get into. And like right off the bat, I'm already like, okay, what am I reading here? What have I got myself into?
Yeah, I was struck by how quickly this is paced out. And did they introduce all 7 of the Umbrella Academy kids in the first issue?
Yes.
I believe they do, but it is a lot of information to absorb at once. So I can see that being difficult. And I almost wonder, the difficulty for me really is that I watched the Netflix show first. And so I have a lot of background information coming into this. Well, and the second trade actually is going to get into, and then further on gets into some of the other children and stuff like that. But that's not something that's addressed at all here. So a lot of it is either stuff that we're going to get into further down the line, or that I feel like I'm bringing knowledge to it that maybe isn't necessarily in the book. So.
Yeah. The hardest part for me was keeping track of the children. So there are 7 children, and each of them is sort of given a number designation, which that in of itself is not bad, because then you just associate the numbers with the children, or, whatever their powers are, because of course, they have superpowers. Otherwise this would be very weird and you'd have a bunch of kids and then that would just be the end of it. So they have superpowers, but they also get, I guess they have alter egos and like, I wouldn't say hero names, but like,
kind of like superhero identities.
Yeah. So they have these identities as well. And so that's where it gets difficult, is like, I know that Clark Kent is Superman. And so if you say one or the other, I know pretty well who you're talking about. But, when it's like, oh, number 6, and then you're like, oh, wait, which one was 6? Was it Clark or was it Bruce? And
right.
It gets difficult to keep track of. So I tried to, in my notes, like keep score so that way I could keep track during reading. And then also, we can do that here while we're talking about it. So just a quick rundown on the kids. Number 1, he excels at physical activity. He's got super strength, all that good stuff. Number 2 is reckless and apparently can hold his breath indefinitely. I guess he hit the superpower jackpot there.
Well, he's also really good with knives. He's like really accurate with throwing blades and stuff.
Yeah, you see him on the cover throwing a knife. Okay. Number 3 is insufferable and narcissistic, but extremely useful.
Okay, so this is interesting because you wrote that. They don't really explain this within the story, I've now realized, but she's called the rumor, and the reason is because she says to somebody, I heard a rumor, and then whatever statement she makes, they'll have to do what she says. So she actually has mind control abilities, but they don't really make a big deal of it or explain it within the story very well.
Got it.
But that's her deal.
So then number 4 has, they say psychic abilities, but it's more like telekinesis.
Yeah.
But also has the ability to speak with the dead. And so his name is the Seance, which that one, speak with the dead, Seance. Okay, that's easy enough to remember. You just got to throw the number 4 in there and then you're good to go. Number 5, the description at the beginning is disappeared, but isn't missed, apparently. So, but number 5 disappears into the future, and there's this whole thing about aging, and it's really, really weird. But I guess his thing is uncontrollable time travel and aging, but staying as a child.
Well, so basically what he does, he's a teleporter, but he learns how to teleport. He learns how to time travel with his teleportation. And so he goes to the future, and then he's stuck there and he can't figure out how to get back. Once he time travels back to where the kids are, he messes up. And what ends up happening is you can only jump back into your previous body. So he's a 60-year-old man, but he jumps back into his 10-year-old body. So that's weird. What's going on with him. So he has to jump back into his existing body from that time in order to time travel back there. So that's why he looks like a kid, but he's actually like older than everyone else. And he's lived like this entire life at the end of the world, basically. So that's what's up with number 5. He's also the only one that doesn't have another superhero identity. Like they pretty much just call him number 5. And so they all haven't seen him in 20 years or something like that.
Yeah. I think they called him like the boy or something. Just
the
boy description. So then we have number 6, who is naive but gruesome.
I believe that's Ben, right? So Ben is dead when the story starts, I believe. He's the monster. And so he has all these tentacles and things that he can shoot out of himself. It's almost like he opens a portal in his chest and like this monstrous entity comes out that can grab stuff. But we really only see him for the first issue because for the rest of the story, he's passed away. And I don't think they really explain what he died from, except that number 1 might have been at fault somehow.
Yeah, there's some kind of line about Ben. I remember that now. And I was like, who the heck is Ben? And then I was like, Uncle Ben? But then we don't find anything more about that. So I forgot about it.
Yeah, he's number 6.
Okay.
So.
And then last and certainly least is number 7, who is just a mediocre violin player who, according to Hargreaves, there's just nothing special about her, which actually is quite a lie, as we find out in this story, but we'll get to that.
Right.
Don't want to spoil the ending here at the beginning. And also Hargreaves doesn't like it when they call him Dad. They have to call him Hargreaves or the monocle.
Yeah,
monocle, sir.
Which again, he really reminds me of Professor Broom from Hellboy, because he's kind of that character that he's sort of raising the kids, but he's also conditioning them to basically fight monsters and supervillains and stuff. So he's using them in a way. And so there is a very, I would say Professor Broom in Hellboy is a much more loving character than Professor Hargreaves is in Umbrella Academy. Hargreaves is definitely more about the mission, more about like, well, you guys just have to be of use to me, and that's why you're here, that kind of thing. And so him adopting them wasn't necessarily great for their like interpersonal skills and stuff. And you see that throughout the story, as far as like they have a lot of trouble getting along and they have a lot of issues because of their dad. And they do have a mother, sort of, but she's a robot that was constructed by the professor. And then they have a butler, Pogo, who is a monkey who's had his intelligence advanced. So
he's also a doctor too, isn't he?
He is. Oh, yes, a Dr. Pogo. Yes, yeah. There you go.
Yeah, the mother kind of looks like one of those like mannequins, but not like a figured mannequin, but more like one that you would hang a dress on, and it's got that like instead of legs, it has that big like dress kind of. I don't know what the technical term is for that, but
like
the
that
bottom part of the
wireframe
dress.
that they put
Yeah,
under it
like
to
a
make it
wireframe.
like fan out. Yeah.
But then she has organs that you can see too, which is
Right. Yeah,
weird.
that's interesting as well, because she looks more like she's almost a cyborg in the comic, whereas in the Netflix show she's explicitly an android. So yeah, that's a interesting that they.
Yeah, that would be a hard look to recreate in live action and have it be
Yes.
functional as well.
Yes, I think so.
Well, and back to your comment about Professor Broom, this really opens kind of like that, where you have some guy who basically takes a superpowered unknown being, which in this case there's 7 of them instead of one Hellboy, but takes them, raises them, and then after maybe the second act is killed off and they have to go on without him, because
Right.
kind of similar to that, where it's like, okay, now who are they without him, and he raised them, but how much loyalty do they really have to them, and now they can talk smack about him because he's gone, and that
Right.
kind of thing. So but the pacing is really weird at the beginning, because first you have him collecting the children, and then 10 years go by and there are a bunch of kids, and so they come out for this adventure to find out what's going on with the Eiffel Tower, because somebody falls off of it, but then maybe they were pushed, it was a murder, but then we find out that it's somehow possessed, but then actually it's a spaceship that's being piloted by the dead engineer, who is now a zombie robot, and he is able to escape with the Eiffel Tower. And he blasts off. And so the kids are like, well, we saved all these people, so let's get ice cream. And then they give them the key to the city. But number one is like, oh, I dream about going into space one day. And then the next page is like, 20 years later. And now number one is this like big beefy dude with a child face with a receding hairline, and they call him Space Boy. And suddenly he's just out in outer space on a planet. And I'm just like, okay, what was the whole point of that Eiffel Tower scene? Like, did they go on regular adventures as kids, and that was just a snapshot, or did they just surface for one day and then go back into hiding?
I think the implication is that they had adventures like that regularly, and that was just kind of one out of time. But the thing about Space Boy that's interesting is he was sent to the moon, and while everybody else stayed on Earth, and he doesn't harbor a lot of the animosity towards Professor Hargreaves that the rest of them do, because he hasn't really been around him as much.
Okay.
And he's more kind of like committed to the mission. And also he's ahead on a gorilla body, because as they explain in like one panel, there was an accident and the monocle had to save his life. And so he apparently got rid of his regular body and put him on a gorilla. So
wow, I missed that completely.
Yeah, it's like one panel where they show it.
Huh.
And it's just like a flashback. But yeah, that's why he's so big. That's why he's so like hairy and everything. So he can't really relate to humanity in the same way. So he's kind of up on the moon doing his own thing, just like waiting for the apocalypse, basically.
Okay.
And that's kind of his deal.
And that's Space Boy.
Yeah, that's Space Boy.
Luther, aka number one.
Yep. Yeah, most of them do have civilian names. Number 2, the Kraken, the one that can hold his breath, is Diego. Number 3 is Allison, the rumor. Number 4 is Klaus, who can speak with the dead. They all have the same last name. It's Hargreaves, because he actually legally adopted them. Again, we said number 5 doesn't have a name. Number 6 is the one that got killed in between issues 1 and 2. So he's not really super important, but he's Ben. And then number 7 is Vanya, the violin player.
Mediocre violin player.
Yes, mediocre violin player.
It's like player. Not even a superpower. She plays violin, but not that well.
So a character beat that they do show us early on is they show the professor talking to Vanya while everybody else is going on their adventure. And she's like, well, I want to go down and join them and help them. And he's like, well, you can't do anything. You're useless. You should play your violin, basically. And that seems to be also kind of a snapshot out of time of like how he treated the kids. It's like they're a means to an end. They're not really his kids in the loving sense. So
he didn't adopt them to raise them. He more just brought them in so that he could train them
Right.
for his purposes.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too, because like we do get a snapshot in this 20-year future where we see a book sitting on number 7 in her apartment, and it says something about number 7, my life, or something like that. I forgot now, but
Yeah, My Life in the Umbrella Academy, or
Yeah.
something like that.
But from what I could understand, she basically just wrote a autobiography about how much it sucked being in the Umbrella Academy and how she didn't want anything to do with them, and probably elaborates on a lot of that. I think that was the difficulty getting into the story, is there are all these little snapshots, but not knowing anything going in. I'm thinking that this is like the breadcrumbs that they're giving us, I'm just taking as part of the story, when in actuality it's supposed to be, there's a lot of stuff that happens. Here's like a little bit of something, a little sprinkle, but there's really more to it. It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of subtext that's left on the table, and I think this is mainly a problem with the first issue, because I think it's paced out a little bit better as it moves along. But the first issue, they hit you with a lot of information. And like you said, there was some stuff that you missed. The tell-all book being really scathing, and the accident that Spaceboy went through that caused him to be on a gorilla body, and all of that stuff. They really breeze through it very quickly. Even the fact that Hargreaves is a space alien, they just kind of say it and they're like, okay, now we're moving on.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, why is this alien on Earth? Like, why does he want to save the Earth? What's his deal? And they don't really get into that in this story.
Yeah. So the next story beat then is we see the 20-year time frame, which it's a total of 30 years from when the children were born. And we see Spaceboy in space. We see number 7 in her apartment, just basically being normal. And then they get calls that Hargreaves is dead. And so this is where we kind of get that similarity to Professor Broom. And so everybody's kind of going to make their way back to, I guess, the Umbrella Academy to kind of, well, pay their respects isn't the right phrase, but
that's not exactly what they do. Yeah.
No, basically just get together and commiserate about how much he sucked and now he's gone and that sort of thing. But in the midst of this, all of a sudden there are these like robot popcorn buckets that appear and they want to destroy the city and eradicate civilians. And there's a lot of like, I call them scene changes, I guess, but there's where you're going along in the story, and then we shift to something that seems completely unrelated and something that's really wacky. I mean, I guess they're more like popcorn buckets that are robots that are in spacesuits, because they have like these dome clear glass helmets, because they're actually, well, we'll get into that in a second, but it's just like all of a sudden you see this and you're like, what the heck is this? Like, what were they thinking when they wrote this stuff? Like, it's so random. What in the world?
Yeah. So I guess just to set the scene a little bit more, they do talk at the funeral about, they get into, some of them, especially number 2, feel animosity towards Vanya, and she shows up, and then they're basically like, get out of here, because you're the one that wrote the tell-all book about us. You made us look all bad and stuff. And so you can tell that like some of them are a little more sympathetic to her, but Diego especially is just like, we don't want you here. Like, you shouldn't be at the funeral. So there is a rift in the team there. The reason the robot popcorn buckets attack the fair is there's some supervillain that the Umbrella Academy defeated years ago that has programmed these robots to activate if the Umbrella Academy ever were to form again. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they gathered together at the funeral meant that the robots activated. And so they just start killing people at this like amusement park. And so that forces them to actually have to reassemble. And then at that point, they have to go in and, save the day, so to speak. Although I don't think they all go. I believe number 5, the time traveling kid, well, he's not really a kid, but I believe he doesn't go with them, if I'm correct. I think he stays with Pogo. But I know that Luther or Spaceboy, Allison, the Rumor, and maybe one of the others, I think Klaus goes. Then I think Diego goes to like investigate on his own. He's kind of like trying to be a vigilante, and that's kind of his deal. So he's trying to like do the solo, oh, I'm a cool vigilante thing out there and investigate on his own.
Yeah. So the robot popcorn buckets, as I like to call them.
I don't know what they're called.
So they're called the Terminauts.
Oh, okay.
Like astronauts, but terminal. So Dr. Terminal is the evil villain that programs these robots called the Terminauts. And so, they came from him. So they're named after him, but then his name is another on the nose because he has a terminal illness that's eating his body alive. So he invents a suit which allows him to substitute like another person's body for the illness to consume. So that way his body is consumed more slowly. And so we get this whole like, short little backstory and we're subjected to, or number 3 was subjected to his monologue, I guess was abducted as a child, or there's like some kind of big backstory here that's going on. And so she freezes because she's not able to cope with this. And then number 5's not able to help because, he's in the body of a 10-year-old child. And so he's not really able to help them fight. But yeah, so they fight these popcorn buckets. They say weird catchphrases like happy face eggs. And one of the, I think, robots says, make sweet lemonade, sweet with blood.
Yeah. It's very clear that they're going for, it's almost like a parody of edgy comics from the 90s in a way, because it's like there are some scenes of like just gut exploding violence, but it's played almost for comedy in a way, like because it's so cartoony, it's so over the top and ridiculous. It's kind of like, I don't know, like I get the sense that the writer and the artist are very aware that they're going for a very specific, very like over the top tone here. So even when it gets really violent, it never feels scary or horrifying or anything like that. It's more just like, yep, this is another crazy page in what is the Umbrella Academy. So
yeah, it's more like the cartoony fighting where it's like, there are laser blasts everywhere and people are getting smashed and bashed around, but it's not like gory or violent, or you're watching these like full page spreads of like somebody getting ripped apart or something. Yeah, nothing like that. It's more sort of like on that cartoon violence level, and it's really not about the fighting. It's just it ends up happening because they've got powers, they need to use them. Hold your breath while the popcorn buckets are killing people. That'll really help.
Right.
Well, he can hold it indefinitely, so I guess he doesn't breathe at all.
That's really interesting because they don't really talk about that on the show ever. They play up the knives thing, and they don't play up the underwater thing.
I mean, I would do the same.
Which is interesting because it seems like the comic book really goes the opposite way, where they really play up the like fact that he can just breathe underwater forever, which I don't know how useful that is, but that's exactly his power.
So yeah, there's all this fighting, and then we have Vanya show up. And so this is sort of where we start to move the story forward, because she shows up to, I guess, find out what's going on with everybody. And she's heard Hargreaves is dead. So she wants to, I guess, reconnect with them in some kind of way. But she shows up to this, happy face eggs battle royale that's going on. And she almost gets blown up. So I don't know if it's Kraken or whatever, but he says, he basically tells her off. He's like, I used to think I had a sister, but I've got nobody, so you can get lost. So she runs away. She's crying. She's distraught. And this is the perfect time for the kid who everybody thinks has no powers to get abducted by the real villain of the story, and more evil ensues. So basically she goes running to this villain who's called the Conductor, who basically looks like he's got a Dracula collar up around his neck. And he conducts an orchestra called the Orchestra Verdammten, which basically is like the Orchestra of the Damned, or something like that, roughly translated from German. So we find out that it really sucks to be the non-powered kid in a group of superpowered child heroes. And so the conductor is able to listen to her sob story, but then also he seems to have Hargreaves' notes. And he knows that she has this potential to be the most powerful of the group, but he's like, oh, I just need to hook you up to this machine and inject you with stuff and cause you some pain, and then you'll be super powerful. And I don't know like where he got this or how he knew or anything like that, but he seems to know about her and is able to push her over the edge to make her into kind of her own character, but she ends up being a villain instead because he's a villain. So I guess why not?
Yeah, well, I have a question about this because it does feel like her turn is justified by her character a little bit in that she becomes a supervillain when like everyone's rejected her, even her brothers and sisters have rejected her, at this point, and they've all basically everybody's been telling her that she's been worthless her whole life, even the person that went out of his way to adopt her.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is, and I don't know if this is really in the story or not, does her turn into full supervillain come because there was some kind of mind control agent in what the conductor did to Vanya? Or do you think the potential was always there and she was going to turn into a supervillain anyway? I mean, because it almost seems like once he starts trying to transform her and like amp up her power levels, that she starts to protest a little bit, and then he's like, no, it'll be over soon. And they, they just took up more tubes to her, and then she has her, white violin suit on or whatever afterwards. But
yeah, this was an interesting transition, and it seemed like something was going to happen with the quiet kid. I didn't know if it was going to be like a Gohan moment of she was going to rush in and save the day, or what was going to happen. Of course, as soon as I saw that conductor guy in his Dracula getup, I was like, oh, okay, she's going to the dark side. But there's really not enough in these issues to really explain anything. So, I mean, as far as the impact that her turn had on me, just reading this for the first time and not having any exposure to it outside of this, it seemed justified enough because there was that book where she wrote about her life. She didn't seem to like it. Hargreave didn't seem to be very nice to her. There was one guy who was kind of nice to her, one of the other kids, but then he basically told her to get lost and I don't have a sister. You're dead to me, blah, blah, blah. So it seemed like enough with what I knew about the character to justify her, running to this conductor guy. And then I don't even know what he injected her with. So at that point, when you fall into a vat of chemicals, I mean, usually you come out evil. You don't come out a good character.
That's kind of a comic book rule at this point, isn't it?
Yeah.
You fall into a vat of chemicals and you come out evil.
I mean, who comes out good from that?
Unless you're struck by lightning and then hit chemicals at the same time. And that'll make you a superhero. But the reason I ask is because her turn and her story is something that I feel needed fleshing out more. And I think the character relationships are all there, but it did feel a little bit unsatisfying. And again, maybe it's not fair because I've watched the show, but that has a much higher focus on the character interactions, what their perspectives are, and those kind of things before all of these events happen. And that makes all of this feel a little bit more natural. Whereas this is more of a like quick paced, we've got to get to the next like weird sci-fi thing. And it's a lot of the sci-fi stuff is not explained really. It's just kind of like, well, here it is and it's happening. So I think that if you're a fan of this genre, your mileage with that stuff may vary because sometimes it's nice not to explain things. I actually think it's very funny that they just have a super intelligent ape and they're like, yeah, he's just a super intelligent ape. The professor just made him that. He talks. It's fine. And there's no explanation. But then there are some things like, more of Vanya's backstory, showing more depth on that and maybe more depth on just the character relationships and establishing them a little bit more, I think would have been helpful leading up to the moment where she turns.
Yeah, I guess like there are some things that they sort of explain with a tagline of dialogue and some things they just force you to accept. And it's interesting because certain things seemed easier to accept to me than others. Like for some reason, the like super intelligent doctor talking ape dude seemed like normal. I was like,
Yeah, it's like, that's
Yeah,
fine. It's
Planet of the
comic book.
Apes. I mean, I don't really need it to know anything about his backstory, or maybe he's like a rocket raccoon where it was experiments, or maybe it was just some kind of lab accident, or who knows. But no big deal. But like the octopus and the pink guy at the beginning, and the atomic elbow, and some of that stuff, I'm just like, what are we even talking about here? I get so lost. But the transition from child to villain, there was nothing there for me that was like one way or the other. She was basically a blank slate. So she could have gone any direction and it would have been justified, because I really just didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
So, but she does come out, and she is now called the White Violin. She's literally all white with a G string, little musical pun there, but actually there's 4 strings like there are on a violin, but it's basically runs like from her G string all the way up to her neck. And she's got openings on both sides of her body that are shaped like a lowercase f, just like on a violin. So I did want to point this out. A little fun fact here. These F holes on the side of the violin, they serve to transmit the resonance from inside the instrument to ring out with a rich tone. So it's sort of like a guitar where you have that hole that's behind the strings, and the sound kind of comes out of that hole as you strum the strings of the guitar. But what they found when they originally developed the violin in like the 10th century, they had round holes, and then they changed them to a half moon, and then they used some elaborate C shapes. And then finally in the like 16th to 18th centuries, they standardized this like F hole. And so the reason was it actually allows more sound to escape from the body of the instrument from a round hole. And it also takes up significantly less space because, a violin is really small. It's smaller than a guitar. So you can't really have a big hole in it, because it just, I guess, won't work with the size of the instrument. Otherwise it'd be a giant hole and no instrument. But it was interesting that she had that on her body. Didn't know if like she became an actual violin and she was going to like have a bow that she would strum across her stomach, or if this was some kind of outfit that like skin tight outfit. I mean, like skin tight as in that is her skin. Or she has no clothes, and or I don't know, but it was really weird. And I was like, is this a suit? Is this, she just got injected with chemicals and became a white violin? Like it was weird. Like she does have a violin that she plays, so she is not the violin. So I assume those F's on her stomach are not holes. Otherwise, her food would come out when she eats.
Yeah. So interestingly, my understanding of her powers is that it basically, she generates like sound and resonance frequencies and all this stuff and vibrations. And the violin is a way to focus her power. It's something that she can like funnel it through.
Okay.
So that all that you said about like the resonance and the F hole and all that stuff, that actually makes a lot of logical sense, knowing what the nature of her powers are. Because if she's sending out this frequency and then, she's playing the violin, all of that is sort of like amplified by what they did to her. And it makes it way, way more powerful. So, at this point, everybody's in big trouble, because what the conductor wants her to do is play the frequency that will end the world.
Basically.
I mean, he's basically some kind of like death cultist, except he kidnaps and sometimes murders musicians. And he's basically decided that like she's, almost like his version of the Messiah. Like she's the one that's going to realize all their dreams to end the world, basically.
Well, and he also kills some of the orchestra members, right? Like they play wrong notes or they come in at the wrong time or something, and he executes them. Like, no thanks. I don't want to join that orchestra.
Yeah, he's a pretty rough guy. Like, he's got a skull painted on his face too. So I feel like you see him and you know what you're signing up for with that orchestra. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen conductors get mad before when you come in at the wrong time or play a wrong note, but this guy just took it to an extreme.
Never seen him shoot anybody in the face for doing it wrong, though.
I have not seen that. No.
But there is what's that? Is it Red Dragon, the movie at the beginning where Hannibal takes out the flautist because the flautist like ruined the concert or whatever? Yeah. And I don't know why, like it made me think of that. I was just
no, that was good. Yeah, I completely forgot, but no, that's part of it. I think, Gerard Way, being a musician, probably wanted to do some of this on purpose to make it make sense. and probably talk to Gabriel Ba about like, okay, I want to, make sure her outfit is very specific, or I don't know which way that went, but it's there's some
I think
history to it.
That is part of their creative process, because there were some sketches in the back that Gerard Way did of sort of like preliminary ideas for here's what Pogo could look like, here's what the white violin could look like, and things like that. And then Gabriel Ba would take it and reinterpret it and turn it into his thing. But I think he had kind of a starting place with even artwork that Gerard had done and given to him. So
that makes sense. Like that's what I was thinking, is like it really seemed like it was coming from him, but obviously, Gabriel Ba did the art in the book, so that makes sense.
Right.
So yeah, the first thing that Vanya does the white violin does when she becomes a supervillain is she uses a precise amount of sound to split the conductor in half from top to bottom and take his place as leader of the orchestra of Verdampton. So great job there.
Yeah, we don't see the conductor after that. And that scene is the most like violent, gory part of the entire, like, it's pretty PG-13 for most of it. But for some reason, when she's like killing him and splitting him in half, you see like his guts flying out the back and his eyeball and all this stuff. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like they really went for it in that one panel.
Well, we see the same thing when the white violin shows up to blow up the Umbrella Academy.
Oh, that's
She does that to Pogo's super intelligent brains, which are then scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
And they look like regular brains. They don't look like super intelligent brains.
They don't look. What does super intelligent brains look? Super intelligent monkey brains. What do those look like?
I was going to say, if you want to see super intelligent brains, I'll just open up my skull and show you. But anyway, back to the story, where something completely random happens in the midst of all this conductor orchestra stuff. Number 5 is hanging out at some kind of diner, like greasy diner, where guys with red masks and yellow shirts show up, and they have like temp written in these really tall letters on their shirts, and they show up to point laser guns at number 5, the kid who's like a 60-year-old man inside a 10-year-old kid's body who time travel or teleports. So he uses some kind of energy. I'm assuming whatever energy he uses to teleport, time travel, whatever, uses that to basically split them apart. But it's not violent like the white violins is, where you see guts. It's more just he turns them into sort of like black goo that's just all over the diner. Yep. Like, you thought this was a greasy diner beforehand. Well, now it's definitely greasy.
Right.
It freaks out the regulars because it's just like everywhere. So I don't know if that was his power, or if these guys in gas masks and shirts, these temps, are made of that substance, but they don't come back after that. So I don't know what the point of that scene.
So this is something that is picked up in the second trade later, where they get much deeper into his powers and the nature of his time travel. But the temp agents are temporal agents. Okay. And they work for the temp agency, which actually is an organization that number 5 was working for, where they like basically go through time and they assassinate people that are problems or threaten the timeline. So he quit, and they're basically coming to follow up on that. But that's not explained in this story. That's just like a snippet to sort of like move you along to where they're going to go later. So yeah, I figured that whole sequence wasn't going to land, because I was like, wow, there's no explanation for that in this issue. It's just, here it is. This is what number 5 is up to today. And the character of Agnes, the diner owner, actually show up later as well. So,
okay. I thought that was just a like, we interviewed the local waitress or whatever, and that was just kind of it. So we could see the goop everywhere. But I guess
right. No, it's actually set up for later stuff, but it's just not got anything to do with this story, really.
Yeah. Okay.
It's kind of akin to how you'll have a subplot running through an ongoing comic that maybe is really just going to be involved in the next arc. Like, I don't know, the last thing we read with Kamala Khan, where it's like she discovers the bangles, and we don't really know what the deal is with that, and they don't really resolve it because it's something they're going to follow up later. So
I don't know, just something about bangles versus like guys with gas masks and red faces and yellow shirts, and they say temp, and it's just, I don't know, it's just so unsettling. It's like, what the heck is this?
I can see that. Yeah. Well, their appearance is very ridiculous too.
Yeah.
So
like a lot of things in this comic.
they looked very Hellboy. I mean, they looked very much like something you would see in a Mike Mignola comic book, I thought. So
Well, so then after that, we go back to the White Violin. She shows up to the Umbrella Academy, and that's where we have sort of the final battle that ensues. And so number 4, actually, he isn't, who's the seance guy, isn't able to communicate with Hargreaves. I think he says he's like long dead or he's like dead or something, but he dresses up as him, or he paints himself to look like it. And I guess it's convincing enough because it seems to fool Vanya, and they have a little bit of dialogue. And then he brings in the cavalry. So he brings the dead composer, Igor Stravinsky, the Manchester Children's Orchestra, and the few members of a tribe. I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah, it
reference.
was like the Ube tribe or Use tribe of some African nation. They all come in to play music to sort of combat the evil frequency that Vanya is performing.
Yeah. So I guess we brought a piano player to play accompaniment, and we brought a children's orchestra because I don't know why. And I don't know. It just seemed like a weird group to assemble to fight her. But I guess it seems to kind of work. And he uses basically telling her that, you know, Hargreaves was an abusive father. She's a failure. She can't even destroy the world properly. So he's like getting into her head and convincing her to back down. But then number 5 shows up and just shoots her in the head, and then she's dead and it's over. And I'm like, well, okay, well, that was very surprising and shocking.
Yeah.
But then it's not over because she had already used her music powers to pull a chunk of the moon down to come crashing down on the earth. But then number 4 is able to use his telekinesis powers to basically pop it like a giant balloon, and the crisis is averted. That's the end. Hooray.
Yeah. So,
like, well,
it's,
okay.
It's hard to break down exactly what's happening. There is some sense of urgency during the story because number 5 is telling them basically, so I've seen the apocalypse. I traveled to the future. I know what the future is. I was the only living person there. And so he's kind of the one that is trying to set the stakes for everybody and get them to realize how serious the situation is. But you also realized how heartless he is by the end of it. Like going to the end of the world and living there for 50 years has kind of broken him because he has like no qualms about just shooting their sister in the head to end it at the end. And everybody else is a little bit shocked. They're like, you just shot her and everything. And, you know, and the story goes like, well, she's going to recover fully, but she may not play the violin again or something like that. And there's also question that the rumor may not be able to use her abilities again because Vanya does serious damage to her vocal cords.
Oh yeah.
During the fight. So there are some what feel like further reaching repercussions of what happened here, but they do save the world in a way.
Yes.
It's just they save the world from their own group, kind of. But
well, the chunk of the moon would have done some damage.
Yeah, the chunk of the moon would have done some damage for sure.
Which it probably will do damage anyway, because the moon would have an unstable orbit, and who knows what would happen to the tides, and it probably maybe that's what causes the apocalypse right there.
So it's funny because I know where the story moves from here on the Netflix series, but I haven't read the next trade 100% yet. Like I've just started it. So I don't know if it's the same way that they play it out, but it is interesting because they do end season 1 of the show and this comic book in about the same place story wise. So I wonder how faithful it is moving forward. But I did want to ask you about the music battle. There is a section where they're kind of sending music notes back and forth, even though they're actually like physically fighting in between that. Like some of the orchestra members get up and start fighting because they have like 13 rests until the next time they have to play or something.
14.
So he's like, get up and start fighting.
Yeah. So
yeah. What did you think of that? Because it all I thought of was like, oh yeah, the music battle in the Doctor Strange movie. Like it reminded me of that a little bit.
I got hung up on the 14 measures of rest thing because so you have this orchestra and they're playing. And so they're like, oh, you have 14 measures of rest, get up there and fight. And so they have weapons and they run up there and they start brawling. And I'm like, 14 measures is going to be not very long. Like maybe 30 seconds, depending on what
really?
the tempo is. So
oh my
I'm
gosh.
just like, they don't have that much time to fight. And for some reason that just like threw me off and I kind of missed some of the panels of what was going on. So I didn't pay much attention to the like music notes flying everywhere.
It's so interesting because the precise nature of the threat in this story is like perfect for you to dissect personally, because you've got a degree in music theory. So if they get stuff wrong, you're going to notice it. And that's going to be more distracting to you than it would like the general reader,
Yeah, I guess there wasn't a whole lot of that, but that was one part that just kind of hung me up. And I was like thinking about it like, well, it probably wouldn't be that long. Because they're probably not playing something super slow that's like lulling them to sleep. This is a battle. So we're probably at a quick pace that's going to rile everybody up to fight. But, of all the things to pick in this story, that would not be the thing that would, derail me or I wouldn't be able to read this because of that. It was just something weird that stuck out that I was like, why are they getting up? Get back. You'll get shot.
But the flying popcorn buckets were okay. Fine. So I guess we're probably about ready to move to final thoughts. There were just a couple of other things I wanted to add, mainly that, do you think that there's any reconciling the family after this? Because we do know that there are more comics after this. And along with that, does where this ends off leave you wanting to read more? Or are you kind of just like, I'm good after this?
It's funny because like I feel like I'm good after this. Like it's just so weird and wacky. And there's just so much going on that didn't make sense or add up or wasn't explained, but also that was just super weird in general. So even if you explained it, it's still weird. And, the explanation doesn't necessarily help, but actually talking through it and thinking about some of the points and refreshing on ones that I missed, it definitely has the core of an interesting story, but I don't know that, the way that it's portrayed here is really the way that I would want to digest it. But there's a lot of like deep backstory here that they just like show you a little bit and they're like, it just goes right over your head if you're not familiar with it.
Right. Yeah. So with that in mind, how many bananas would you give this?
So this was a hard one because I knew it was weird going into it and I was expecting that I probably wouldn't like it. And I found out after just sort of talking about it here, it made me find some things that I enjoyed about it that would be interesting if the presentation were a little easier to follow or some things made a little bit more logical sense. Could be interesting, but it's also really weird. And the weird things that happen and the things that they have to do in order to fight, like, okay, I'm going to use my telekinesis powers to levitate us up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. And then I'm going to use these powers to open the Eiffel Tower and find out that it's a, dead zombie robot, whatever. It's just so out there that it's not really my cup of tea there. So it's hard too, because I want to frame this in with other things that I've reviewed. So like Ratchet and Clank, I think was my lowest review because I gave that like a 2 out of 5. And it was really because I felt like they had all of the materials to make a really awesome comic and they just didn't use them.
Yeah.
Like they had all the stories, and it was even the same writer. Right. So I felt really harsh on that one because I was like, it should have been better. I don't know. Like I just thought that it wasn't as good as it should have been. Right. With this, coming in with a blank slate, I don't have that feeling. So it's easier to sort of rate it lower, but I see that little spark, kind of like the origin of Hellboy that we read where, like you said, the TV show filled in all the gaps. I feel like there's a lot of gaps that I'm missing here, but I feel like there's a core to it that could be really interesting. And I would say I'd probably settle on a 2.5 5, just to give it a little higher rating than Ratchet and Clank, because like I said, there are things that I would want to learn more about this, but it's also really weird, and it's not something that I would want to devote a lot of time to reading.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting because I'm having a really hard time rating this as well, but my perspective is I knew a lot about it coming in because I had seen 2 seasons and 1 episode worth of the Netflix show, before reading this. So coming into it, a lot of the backstory and things that I just sort of accept and know are not necessarily on the page here, but I know them and they sort of fill in the gaps so that it's easier for me to follow. I don't know that that's fair to enter that into my rating, though. Honestly, me, like I always give points for like a cool concept. And I think this is definitely a cool concept that has legs. I mean, that's why it's gotten a 3rd season at Netflix, because the characters are actually pretty rich. They have a lot of stuff that they can put them through, and with the time travel aspect and sort of them finding a way to heal as a family and all that, there's a lot of stories that they can tell with these characters. I just feel like this specific story, there was a lot that wasn't on the page that maybe should have been on the page. So, maybe blow up this story into 7 or 8 issues and give more backstory on some of the characters, do something like that. I realize that's a common criticism that I have of like, hey, maybe make this a little bit longer. That unfortunately is not a reality in the comic book world, because editors often say we want a 6-issue mini because that's how we can sell trades. And that's the size a trade is usually. So the 6-issue arc has become kind of a standard. And I think, some writers get away from that, but I think that's pretty much a standard. And so it does feel very compressed, and it feels like there's too much story for the number of pages that we get here. I think I am going to go a little bit higher than you and give it a 3, only to balance it out again, just slightly higher than what the Ratchet and Clank total would get, because I think that Wei and Ba get points for having a really cool concept that's really different than anything else. It's just that the implementation, it's not as professional as I know that Gerard Way's writing becomes later on. You know what I mean? Like this is one of his early efforts in the comic book genre, and I know that he had room to grow. And I definitely think that it's a good idea, and it's just they didn't quite land the implementation of that idea. So it's going to be 3 out of 5 for me.
Yeah, even with like at the beginning of each issue, they sort of give you a rundown of each child and sort of where they're at, or I guess character, because they're 30 by the time we get to later in the story. And they have these like weird kind of, well, they're quips at the beginning, at the like the last page of each issue, but then it starts to get more ominous as it goes on. But like those moments that they use to sort of just like add some snarky stuff, like they could have used those to add some more a synopsis of the previous story, or, hey, there's a lot going on here, let's give you a little summary. A lot of times when you get issues, they do that. They like, this is what happened during the last issue, just give you a quick little snippet. So that way you can continue reading and like, oh, okay, if you missed anything, it will fill in those blanks, especially if you're reading them like a month at a time. But with this, I felt like they really didn't give you anything. There was no kind of help. Like not every story can be an origin where we learn about the characters and everything and where they came from and flesh out their entire backstories. But with this, I felt like it was just like, here's some stuff. And, that's just the way it is.
They threw you into it too much without, it was like, what's the phrase, in media res, when you start a story already in progress. It very much feels like that. And it does leave a lot of mysteries to be unraveled later. But it does feel like there's not enough meat on the bone for this specific story. I do want to say, though, I really do like the sort of like slapsticky over the top tone that the art and the writing has together. I think those two creators work well together. Oh, yeah. And I would like to see this done. And again, maybe as I get into the later trades, which I do plan on reading on, because it'll be interesting for me to compare to the show, at least. But it'll be interesting to see as they move on, because there are years between some of these trades. how Wei's writing voice matures and, you know, how the characters change and stuff like that. But yeah, 3 out of 5 for this, 2.5 for you. So you're right down the middle.
All right. And there we have it. So
Yeah.
what do we have next time?
So next time on We Like Comics, because they have no bones, we're going to be reading Hawkman Awakening by Robert Venditti and Brian Hitch. So stick around.
He did he?
He certainly did.
All right. Well, it'll be fun to learn about the Hawkman, the man known as Hawkman.
Yeah, man. Whether you like Katar Hall or Carter Hall, we're going to be talking about both of them. So
Next
stick
time.
around.
We like
Comics.
because they